Hi, and welcome back to Hill and Ponton's VA Disability Blog. I'm Natalia Joffrey, the company COO.
And I'm attorney Ann Lynn Scott.
And today, Ann, you're going to be talking about combat veterans and VA benefits.
Yes.
So I guess the first and most basic question is, what is considered combat in military service?
So the VA will define combat as basically any veteran who was deployed into a combat territory. And they're basically for service to count as combat. It's determined by an executive order issued by the president. So you can find the exact, there's online, there's whole lists of exact dates and locations, theater of operations, and where those were that were basically hostile combat environments. But it has to be more than just your, standard military service being deployed.
Okay, so what if they were present at the time and at a location where it's known that combat was occurring, but they perhaps necessarily weren't engaged in direct combat as one would normally know it?
So the special rules that we'll get into, or the different principles that apply for VA claims for combat veterans, those only apply if the veteran was actually engaged in combat. So let's say you were deployed and some of your missions were combat missions, but something happened to you while you were on base and there wasn't necessarily combat going on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
The regular rules regarding service connection would apply there. There's no presumptions or lowered evidence standards on that.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's more important to really focus on, were you
engaged in combat?
Right. Were you on a combat mission? Were you, was it the middle of, enemy fire? Things like that.
Okay. Are combat veterans more likely to get veterans benefits?
It's not necessarily that they're more likely. It's just that I mentioned before, the special rules applying to these veterans makes the evidence needed to prove that an in-service incident occurred. It lowers the standard or lowers the amount of evidence needed to prove something happened. So it, in effect, makes it easier for a combat veteran to prove service connection for conditions that happened while they were on or engaged in combat.
Okay. Are there any special benefits that they can qualify for as a result of being combat veterans?
So
in
addition to VA disability compensation, there's some special enhanced VA healthcare benefits. That's not through the Veterans Benefits Administration, VBA, it's through the Veterans Health Administration. So it is the VA, but just two separate, entities.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is combat CRSC is what you'll hear referred to as it's retirement pay and special pay that's available to veterans who had military pay withheld or military retirement pay withheld. So we could go on a whole another blog just talking about those different things. But yes, it is important to, if you did serve in combat and you're wondering about that, there's definitely, the VA on their website has sources at least, listing what that those additional benefits are. You can always check our website also. But yes, long story short, there are some additional benefits specifically for combat veterans
that you could potentially qualify for. That's great. Because we know that there are often some contentious points when handling VA claims. What if the VA says, well, you weren't in combat? We don't have records of you being in combat.
And that is probably the biggest issue or biggest hurdle with these types of cases. The whole reason behind the VA lowering the evidence required to prove a service connection claim in these circumstances has to do with the fact that if you're engaged in combat, there's a pretty good chance that there might not be great records documenting, if an injury that happened. If someone
Right.
fell and twisted their ankle in the middle of enemy fire, that's probably not going to be written down, or
Yeah.
just different things like that. And so it's kind of, I guess, ironic in the sense of the whole reason for these special rules can also be the reason why these claims are somewhat difficult, because of the lack of records. So a lot of times the VA may say, well, we don't have service records that this exact event happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that definitely keep fighting for. There's ways to prove it, even if there's not a specific record.
It's so awful, isn't it? Because it's true. Like, you're out in the battlefield, you get an injury. No one is saying, "Hey, let me put down my gun and take a note,"
Exactly.
and add it to your file. Yeah, there's different priorities
Exactly.
at that time for sure. So this hence begs the question, and I know we've talked about these before, and so I have a feeling they're going to apply here. Buddy statements. Is this, can you use buddy statements in these types of claims in order to prove that you were in combat? And if so, who can write them?
Definitely. So the first thing that's important to know is that when we're dealing with describing an incident in combat, or something related to that, as with any veteran statement, the VA has to, the veteran it's credible evidence for the veteran to
Mm-hmm.
say, I was engaged in combat. Having a buddy statement that also supports that from someone that, the best example would be someone that was in your unit, someone that you served with was also there to say, yes, this happened.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great evidence. Unfortunately, the VA sometimes needs more than just the veteran's word.
Right.
But, and we'll get into this a little bit, as long as, what the veteran is saying is kind of in line with the circumstances of their service, the
Mm-hmm.
VA should give that a lot of weight. And so having a buddy statement would just be further supporting evidence.
Okay. Since we're talking about statements, I heard there are requirements for the combat veteran statements. So can you go over what those requirements are and what do they mean?
So the main one is that the statement needs to be credible. Like I
Mm-hmm.
said, the VA, they're supposed to consider the veteran credible. Basically, think of the statement needs to be reasonable. If the veteran needs to be explaining something that is logical. There's plenty of times, where what happened, it may not sound reasonable, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just make sure the statement is detailed, lines up with other events that might have gone on. And that would really be another example of when it's helpful to get a buddy statement to corroborate what the veteran is saying. The other main requirement is that it needs to be in line with the circumstances, or in line with the veteran's MOS, what their duties
Mm-hmm.
were in service. So, and if those two things are there, then basically the VA has to accept it as being valid. If one example, or to kind of go further into that, if the veteran says something happened and it was in combat, and it's within the realm of possibility that, yeah, that sounds like something that would happen if these were the kinds of duties that would go along with that veteran's MOS,
Mm-hmm.
then that is definitely helpful as far as showing that it did happen.
Okay. What are some common conditions associated with combat?
I would say the two biggest ones would be PTSD,
Yeah.
and then gunshot wound residuals. That would
Okay.
be something that you'd see a lot. If you have a gunshot wound residual, chances are, it's not always the case, but it'd be something related to combat,
Can you
seeing
give me an
enemy fire.
example? Can you give me an example of of what a gunshot wound residual is?
So a lot of times, and the ratings on these, it's very, very complicated. The VA will look at a lot of different factors. muscle tears. So if a bullet passes through, tears ligaments, muscles, nerve damage, that can be a common residual related to gunshot wounds. Those claims are definitely very complicated. As far as service connection may not be the complicated side of that, but the ratings and how the VA rates gunshot wound residuals. I think there was like a 3-day seminar just on that issue. So it's definitely a
Wow.
complicated thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any common issues you see in these cases? Any other information that maybe you could convey that would be helpful?
I think the biggest issue is, like I said, the lack of records. And so don't give up. You know, a lot of times a veteran will say, I was in combat and I saw A, B, and C happen. And that's the stressor that I'm saying caused my PTSD. The VA might not have records of what the veteran is saying they saw, and will a lot of times say, well, there's no record that this occurred. They did not look into everything that they're supposed to do. They kind of stopped the analysis short there. So don't give up on that. Remind them of, sometimes you do have to remind the VA of their own regulations. So.
And that's where you come in, right?
Yes, exactly.
I love it. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Anne. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to visit our website or call our office. Otherwise, we hope you'll join us again next time.
Thanks.